in Baltimore, basketball and baseball and the football draft. But I'm going to take a little TO right now if I get the opportunity. And you know how much I like to have authors on and go sort of long form. I don't do NPR, I do NST. But this guy's done a lot of NPR and a lot of intelligent sports radio, which we try to promise you here. He's written a new book about Boston, the Olympics, and money, and cities, and how stadiums get built. I am familiar with his work from the beginning of my career 25 years ago in writing about Camden Yards and facilities like Camden Yards and football teams and baseball teams. He is Andrew Zimbalist. He's a longtime sports economist, a sports radio guy if you've listened to long-form conversation, but the latest book is No Boston Olympics, How and Why Smart Cities Are Passing on the Torch. It is a new book. You can check him out at Amazon or anywhere books are sold. And, of course, if you buy it through the Give a Spit app here at WNST, you help our friends at There Goes My Hero and Leukemia Patients. Andrew, welcome back. It's been a long time. I know you do a million of these things, and, you know, I'm familiar with your professorial work at Smith College. But another book, huh, man? It's a labor of love. I've written 4. There's something very diseased by anyone who writes more than one, right?
Oh boy, yeah. Thanks. It's good to be back with you.
Well, this book, I mean, look, for any author, unless money chases you around and people bring you stupid ideas and you write books, I think most books are something that you think of in the middle of the night and think, I've got to make the baby, I've got to get it out, I've got to get the information out there. Clearly, I'm very familiar with this Olympics thing. I've talked about it at length with a lot of people. I've traveled the world. I'm one of those crazy Americans that actually go to places like Rio de Janeiro. And I also watch documentaries about what's happened to Athens and the level of corruption at FIFA and Switzerland and, how places like Russia and Qatar wind up getting World Cups. You know, this is about money and it's about civics and it's about politics. But the story that gets sold to the public is something that you've spent your life researching and saying, are these allegations true? Will the Olympics really put old Boston on the map? And I guess your conclusion is this is getting a little crazy here in the 21st century, right?
That's exactly right. You know, the IOC has basically had the same business model since 1896 when the modern Olympics began in Athens. And that model may have been appropriate for 1896 because the model was to move the host around from city to city and from continent to continent. Back in 1896, of course, the world didn't have international jet travel. It didn't have the internet, didn't have satellites beaming international television signals all around the world, didn't have telecommunications internationally. And so back then, if you wanted people to experience the Olympics, you had to move it around. Now that's not true. 99% of the people who experience the Olympics are experiencing it on the internet or on television. And they don't have to travel to Rio. They don't have to travel to Vancouver or Beijing or some other city around the world.
And their toilets flush better than they do in Sochi, apparently, too, right?
Excuse me?
And their toilets flush better than they do in Sochi, too, still, right?
That's right. So what the IOC does with this model is, the IOC, obviously, it's a monopoly. It's the only organization that produces the Olympics. It's a very popular product. And they conduct an auction every 4 years to see who's going to get the honor to host the Olympics 7 years down the road. So they award the games 7 years ahead of time, but the games, of course, are every 4 years. And when you conduct an auction like that, and you have the amount of power that the IOC has, and the IOC can say to a city, we need 35 venues, we need a $3 billion Olympic Village, we need an international broadcasting and media center, we need 3,000 acres of green space and ceremonial space. They can say whatever they want, and they say a lot more than that, by the way.
And we need suites for kings to sit in the upper deck and bring their minions,
and also
all that.
Transportation lanes. So they're guaranteed when Thomas Bach, the head of the IOC, is traveling from one Olympic cluster to another, he doesn't have to put up with the hassles of traffic jams. So this is royalty. They want to be treated as royalty, and that discombobulates the city. In any event, when you're in this kind of a world, and the IOC has got cities competing against each other, then the price of hosting, the cost of hosting, just goes higher and higher and higher. And these days, it's about $15 to $20 billion for hosting the Summer Olympics. You contrast that with the maybe $4 billion that they pull in revenue, the city pulls in revenue, and the city has a pretty sizable financial deficit.
Was this thing always greasy? I mean, when did it get greasy, Andrew? I mean, and I would say the same thing for the Baltimore Colts that rolled into Baltimore in 1949 and said, let's just go have a club and have a team. And, the Orioles came here and, and this begat losing the Colts, building Camden Yards. You wrote a book about it 25 years ago, and I'll get into that. I know sort of when sports went from being something that only, the owners and the lords of the realm made money on to something that, agents have gotten involved in. Now cities get involved. We're seeing 3 teams in the NFL move. I get it from an American perspective, but the Olympics to me probably started as like truly a goodwill sort of feel-good thing, right? I mean, I don't think the beginning of it was, let's go make $1 billion off of it. The original intent was probably, let's figure out who the fastest man in the world really is, right?
Exactly. The Olympics were conceived of and still are an athletic event. It's not a construction event. Many people have turned it into a construction event, but it's an athletic event. It's an opportunity for the world's greatest athletes to compete against each other on the playing field rather than to fight against each other on the battlefield, and that's a good thing. And if it's going to be done right, we have to go back to that original idea and worry about implementing that idea in the most effective way possible. The notion of building every year larger and larger stadiums with more and more luxury boxes and more signage it just makes no sense whatsoever. And what's happened to the IOC, as you know, is that as the extravagance has grown out of control and as the financial deficits have gone out of control, there are fewer and fewer cities that are willing to host the games. So back in 2000, they hit a peak. There were maybe each time they put the auction up, there were about 10 cities that wanted to bid, and since then it's been going lower and lower and lower. They hit the bottom in 2015 when they were auctioning off the 2022 Winter Olympics. They had 5 European cities plus Almaty, Kazakhstan, and Beijing, China. But one by one, San Moritz, Switzerland, Munich, Germany, Oslo, Sweden, Krakow, Poland, and Oslo, Norway, they all either had referendums or they had city council votes, and they all dropped out. And so the IOC was left to pick between 2 authoritarian countries, Almaty, Kazakhstan, and Beijing, China. And now for the 2024 Summer Olympics, Boston has dropped out, Toronto dropped out, Budapest dropped out, Rome dropped out, and Hamburg dropped out.
All because of corruption, right? I mean, they didn't absolutely come out and say that, right?
But part of it's corruption, and people are noticing the corruption and being turned off to it. But part of it is that people are getting smart, and they're realizing that there are more important things to spend money on in the world than building Olympic monuments to the IOC.
Well, the city of Oakland just decided that, let the Raiders go play in Vegas, right? I mean, the city of San Diego said, let the Chargers go play wherever the hell Carson is, right? I mean, that's going on more, right?
That's a fair but an incomplete analogy. And the reason it's incomplete is this, that when the Raiders play in Oakland or when the Rams play in St. Louis, the city of St. Louis and the city of Oakland have an enduring force of entertainment.
Sure.
And that entertainment is something that helps identify the city and helps create community in the city because people share rooting for their team. So they go to the workplace and they talk about how did the Raiders do last night or how did the Rams do last night, and it gives them something that binds them together. And it's sometimes, not often, but a team will they'll go to the postseason and they'll win a division series or they'll win the championship. And you've got people high-fiving each other at the ballpark or in the arena and having the time of their lives. Their community has won something, has done something, and they're all exulting in that experience.
I know this feeling. I was in Pittsburgh for a hockey game the other night. I mean, you see the difference between what it looked like in Pittsburgh the other night versus what it looked like in Detroit when they're not in the playoffs, right? I mean, the amount of economy that goes on is real, it's measurable, it's substantial, and, I see it in Baltimore with Camden Yards is full versus empty. I mean, and, I guess that's an eternal argument, but at least there is something there. I mean, Atlanta's now torn down.
There, and it's not there for the Olympics, because what happens with the Olympics is you get a circus rolling into town for 17 days and then disappearing. And it does not build community. Now, it might be the case if everything goes well that there's 17 days having a feeling of pride, but it's ephemeral. It comes and it goes. And there's no enduring source of entertainment and community binding values that are going on. So what generally happens is not only are you spending $15 or $20 billion doing all of the constructions and preparing and implementing the games, but then you've got these venues that you don't need, and you've got to maintain them, and maintaining them costs tens of millions of dollars a year.
I've seen the video of the crabgrass growing in the Athens baseball field for a trial sport in a country halfway, around the world where they don't even play baseball. I've seen the Manaus Stadium. If you ever want to do the damnedest thing for our audience, Google map Manaus, Brazil, and see that there are no roads that go into the Amazon jungle in the middle of a continent with, piranhas and monkeys and pretty birds and a lot of rainforest that Sting's still trying to keep upright. And they cut down some of that and plopped a stadium for 60,000 people down to be used essentially about 5 times, correct? And it sits there, and the Brazilian government built that. Hey, look, they're building these stadiums over in Qatar right now for a World Cup. They're going to play in 118 degrees in a country where they didn't even play soccer 15 years ago. So it really is the damnedest thing when there's that much money and someone has their hand into the government's money to try to bring whatever the next vote is, right? But, I mean, no one in Brazil is real hot and bothered now that the Olympics is gone, right?
Well, I think they're hot and bothered by what the Olympics and the World Cup brought to them. Because you point out the situation in Manaus, and they have a second division soccer team there that draws 1,000 people to its games, and now they have a stadium with 42,000 capacity that cost them $350 million to build. Even worse, they built a stadium for 70,000 capacity in Brasilia, the country's capital. But Brasilia is a part of Brazil that's not into soccer. They have a third division soccer team. And they spent $800 million on that stadium, and they're using it now as a parking lot for buses.
You just educated me. There's a part of Brazil where they don't like soccer? What?
Well, they like soccer maybe the same way that Baltimore likes soccer. Or
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it is what it is. Andrew Zimbalist is our guest. He's got a book out. You can go check it out for sure. He's got a bunch of books. The new book is No Boston Olympics, How and Why Smart Cities Are Passing on the Torch. Hey, give me, from your perspective, why did this book come to you? I mean, I could sit here and, look, dude, you get coffee, stop by my place. We'll sit here all day and talk about that. I love talking about this stuff. But when you do a book, this obviously was important to you, as all of these things have been going back 25 years ago when I discovered you're writing about stadiums, when this city was having a real crisis with all of that.
So I wrote this book with Chris Dempsey, who was the chief organizer of the group No Boston Olympics. They were doing on-the-ground, rank-and-file organizing against the Olympic bid. And it turned out by coincidence that Chris and I were invited by the city of Hamburg, by 2 different organizations in the city of Hamburg, to give talks about the Boston Olympic experience. Boston had the Olympic bid taken away from them by the United States Olympic Committee, and so we discovered that we were in Hamburg at the same time, and we went out for a beer. And we were talking about the Boston experience and realizing that not only Hamburg, but Toronto was seeking our advice, and Rome and Budapest places were seeking our advice. So we thought we should write a book that told the story in Boston, what went wrong in the city of Boston, and how that was similar to what was going on in other cities.
What went wrong, in a couple of sentences, because Boston's not real popular around here this week. I don't know if you heard about the old Adam Jones thing. I know you're a ball fan.
Oh, my God.
So, yeah, that's the next conversation. There's your next book, Racism in America. There, I gave you a topic. I'm sure you'll have that book finished by the weekend, right? I mean, but, from the Olympic perspective for Boston, it's something they haven't had. They've had World Series. They've had parades. They've got Tom Brady. They're cheaters. They've had Stanley Cups. They've had all of that stuff. This would have been a feather in their cap, right? They have facilities, and I'm sure, Bob Kraft would like to put his political muscle behind it at one point, and I don't know what the hell they'd use Fenway Park for, because nobody wants to watch baseball. Maybe they turn it into a hockey park. I don't know. But, the whole notion of Boston being involved, L.A., Atlanta, Salt Lake City, Baltimore and Washington. I remember many, many times back in the 90s trying to get behind that old Baltimore, hey, if L.A. has it and Chicago wants it, we want it too. I don't know why we wanted it. But we did. And now, 20 years later, places like Boston don't think, well, we need to have the torch running up Boylston today, right?
Yeah. So, you mentioned it wouldn't it be a feather in Boston's cap? I think the answer is no. What's a feather in Boston's cap is that the people of Boston stood up to the power structure in Boston. It was a David versus Goliath battle that David won. And
well, it almost feels like patriotism, right? How can you love Boston and not want the Olympics here? You have to want. I mean, I hear the sports fans saying that on WEEI up there, right? I mean, literally. I mean, trying to convince people that it's not red, white, and blue, right?
Well, there are people who believe all sorts of things in the United States, and after a while, you just get tired of trying to explain why they believe those things or why they say those things. Look, basically what happened is democracy worked in Boston. This was a bid that was concocted by a small group of executives, top executives in Boston. The leader of the group was John Fish, who happened to be the head of the largest construction company in New England, Suffolk Construction. It was a bid that was made in Boston's name, even though the Boston City Council never discussed, let alone voted on, wanting to have the Olympics. The state legislature never discussed nor voted on wanting to have the Olympics. It was a small group of individuals that once they got the nod from the United States Olympic Committee that Boston would be the U.S. representative in the international auction to host the Olympics, they refused to share the bid with the public. They wouldn't show the public what was in the bid. And finally, there was enough pressure put upon them, they started releasing bits and pieces of the bid, and it was utter nonsense. They were saying things that were false, and they had concocted ideas like putting the beach volleyball facility in the middle of the Boston Common. People were totally outraged by that. It was one crazy idea after another, and immense expenses and tax subsidies from the government to try to encourage developers to undertake some of these projects. None of it really worked, and there was this general continuing pattern of deception where the mayor signed a joinder agreement with the United States Olympic Committee that said that Boston would enforce the IOC policy that nobody who was an employee of the city of Boston could criticize the Boston bid, could criticize the USOC, or could criticize the IOC. That's great. We're living in a democracy, and you're not even allowed to voice your opinion. There are things like this that were coming out every day, and the citizens of Boston got more and more fed up with it. And finally, the USOC, realizing that only 1/3 of the people in Boston were supporting the bid, and well over 50% were against it, they said, okay, well, we're pulling it from Boston and we're giving it to Los Angeles.
Andrew Zimbalist joining us here. The book is out on the market right now. No Boston Olympics, How and Why Smart Cities Are Passing on the Torch. Talking Olympics, we're going to get into some Camden Yards and some baseball and some football and some other stuff here. Moving from Boston to something that I didn't get on the political bandwagon one way or another for this, but a couple of years ago, 10 years ago, a guy comes to me at a party and says, we're going to bring a Grand Prix to Baltimore. And he kissed my ass a little bit and wanted me to go on the radio and talk about it and polish it up, probably the same way that these Boston people, there was obviously, the carrot at the end of the stick for him to make a lot of money on this and be a hero and, create this new Preakness around Labor Day weekend in Baltimore. They built a racetrack around my home, Andrew. So 6 weeks before the race, they built a racetrack out my windows. I stood to benefit the most because I have a nice view of the track. I had the best view of the track of anyone. Mr. Angelo's got some little work done around to have the pit lanes there, and they try to get everybody in on it. And they build the track. Everyone is inconvenienced that lives within 3 miles of downtown because you couldn't get in or out of the city for 6 weeks. They bring the circus to town, and no one came. And then they lied about how many people came as I took pictures out my window. Then they brought it back the next year because they were obligated to do it, and less people came. And then and it just became this civic fiasco. And fee with a capital fee, a capital ass, and a capital co. You know what I mean? Like the fees were high, the politicians were out, everybody was running for cover, and the thing was a mess. But I originally bought in thinking, well, it would be nice to have 250,000 people to show. Like, I've seen Long Beach, I've seen Monaco. That, not a bad idea. Baltimore is beautiful. We'll be on international TV because everybody in Europe watches, in South America. And, it brings in the right kind of, money spender, the high rollers, the people that are going to want to drink champagne and eat crab cakes. And it got through. It happened here. It didn't really work, and it went away, and everybody, no one sort of paid the price. And then 25 years later, you wrote about Camden Yards and baseball stadiums, and you predicted where all of this thing went 25 years ago, which is why your work has stood the test of time. I think for these communities and which ones it works for and which ones it doesn't. But this really does come down to a small group of people, a lot of times making decisions, and either people stand up and scream bloody murder or they don't. Right? That's the way this works.
I think that's very often the case. You had a very interesting and peculiar experience in Camden Yards, because not only was it the first of a new genre of retro stadiums in the downtown area, which was I think a genius idea by Larry Lucchino that everybody has since copied. But one of the things, of course, that happened in 1992 is that you moved your stadium from the north side of the city around Johns Hopkins that was not connected to any highway arteries, and you put it in the south side of the city, connected to the business district in Baltimore and the wharf area, but also connected by highways to D.C. So what you were doing, in a sense, was annexing this very large market, Washington, D.C., by moving the stadium from the north part of the city to the south part of the city. And so it was extraordinarily successful for the Orioles, and it became a model followed throughout baseball and then subsequently in other sports.
I don't know if you Googled me, but I led a little revolt on Peter Angelos 11 years ago when he was pocketing all the money. I've since learned a lot of information. I've written 14 chapters of a book called The Peter Principles, incidentally, about Peter Angelos and about owning the team and running the team, and $34 million cash out of pocket at $172 million a sell-off back in 1993 after Eli Jacobs went broke. The Camden Yards story is fascinating, bro. You wrote a book on it. You had your hands into the pie, and what happened? It's like the last scene in Animal House. What really became of all these people? Well, let's see. Larry went off to San Diego and built another place. Went off to Fenway Park with Janet Marie. Only a couple of rings there, and the Red Sox are now this renowned franchise. The Orioles have gone into disrepair for large stretches. Their fan base is gone. There's a team in D.C. that was over Angelos' dead body. He squeezed all of the television revenue out of it. And in the end, Camden Yards got built on the backs of my parents and everybody in my audience's parents and aunts and uncles and the lottery and everything that paid for it 25 years ago. But in the end, the guy that made all the money, the guy that's going to leave the poker, I don't know if he's going to leave it because he's going to leave in a casket like all the rest of us, and probably sooner than a lot of us because he's 86, but he's going to leave this with $3 billion in value off of a stadium the people built here. And I know you can make a case for how many hotel nights we've had, the tax base, parking, vendors, hot dog people, restaurants in the community. Many have gone belly up in and around the Orioles when they went, haywire and nobody came to the games for 15 years. But the guy that made all the money in this is Peter Angelos. And he wasn't even a part of getting the stadium built. He just sort of came in, plopped down, and opened the cash register. No one has profited really in any tremendous way, maybe the hearts and souls of Orioles fans, but Peter.
Yeah, well, so what's happened throughout baseball, and it's happened in the other sports as well, is that the new stadiums that have come online are one major source of increase in franchise value, and the new television contracts that have been produced in this era of cable television and streaming and over the top, they've also produced a large chunk of the additional value. And for Major League Baseball owners, another very large chunk of value has come from the MLBAM and the MLBAM tech that they started with their own resources, the best streaming service in practically all of America. And so these are operations in MLBAM and MLBAM Tech that are worth easily over $5 billion. Listen, I thought we were going to go for just 15 minutes, and I've got another interview I've got to do. You said a moment ago that we could talk about this all day. I'm sure we could talk about it all week. But I've got to sign off.
Next time.
Okay.
We'll see you soon.
Okay.
Thank you. Andrew
Yeah,
Zimbalist joining us here. The book is No Boston Olympics, How and Why Smart Cities Are Passing on the Torch. You can find that and all of his work. I mean, I'll sit here and list the books, but the original for me was Baseball in Billions in 1992. Much of it very, very predictive of where the industry went for 25 years. Sports, Jobs, and Taxes, The Economics of Sports, Volumes 1 and 2, May the Best Team Win, Baseball Economics and Public Policy. This is how the sausage is made, and these are the guys that write about it and do good work. So, I apologize publicly to Andrew, but I can get a little off the beaten path. There's no doubt about that. You can find me out in the Buy a Toyota Audio Vault 24 hours a day from anywhere in the world on your mobile device by downloading the TuneIn radio app. We do come in crystal clear from anywhere in the world. And if there's any breaking news, you get it first on the WNST Tech Service. It's all brought to you by Coons Ford of Security Boulevard. And, of course, Dennis is here this Thursday, next Thursday, every Thursday, and he's still all drafted up, but certainly all worked up about the Orioles and brushback pitches and all that kind of stuff as well. So you can check in with him. It's the SSV on WNST, heard here from 3 until 5 each and every Thursday. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Instagram, streaming live on our Facebook as well as our YouTube WNSTV channel. We are WNST.net, AM 1570 and WNST Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.